Now, I don't talk a lot on my channels about myself because I don't think anyone ought to care about me, only the things that I say, but I saw this video and I just had to respond. And to do so, I have to give a little background so that you know that I have some clue what I'm talking about. So, I've been a long-time comic book fan, off and on, for my entire life. So I started reading comics in 1974, just before the big reboot of X-Men, back when they were doing reprints because nobody was actually reading it. And then I got into other Marvel titles and, the rest is history. But like most people, I've read comics, then I dropped them, then I came back to them over and over again as my life has changed. I dropped comics about the time I got into high school, only to have a really good friend who was into them, and I started reading again with X-Men 172. And then I kind of read comics through the early 90s when I got married and I just didn't have time anymore. But since my wife was also a lifelong comic fan, we jumped back into it in the early 2000s, and I followed Marvel through Civil War in 2006, which I hated because of what they did to some of my favorite characters like Spider-Man and Iron Man, so I dropped out again. And I picked it back up a couple of years later, I don't remember exactly when, only to completely leave in the last couple of years because Marvel is no longer writing comics for people like me. They're writing them for SJWs, and it's killing their sales. So now, we get to the video. Let's go ahead and take a look at that.
Is diversity killing comics? Sorry, fanboys, but no.
Actually it is. Well, not just diversity, but a move by Marvel to placate the social justice warriors at the expense of telling good stories with compelling characters. That certainly is responsible.
I don't think that comics is unique in using diversity and specifically marginalized people's representation as a scapegoat for their own marketing or just poor products.
Nowhere has Marvel ever done that, sorry. Well, not until they started listening to you idiots anyhow.
Marvel's vice president thinks new characters are hurting comic book sales. He said what we heard was that people didn't want any more diversity. They didn't want female characters out there.
Well, that's a nice way to take the quote completely out of context. The actual quote by David Gabriel, as told to ICV2, was this. What we heard was that people didn't want any more diversity. They didn't want female characters out there. That's what we heard, whether we believe it or not. I don't know if that's really true, but that's what we saw in sales. Any character that was diverse, any character that was new, our female characters, anything that was not a core Marvel character, people were turning their nose up. But that's not really the truth. It isn't diverse characters that were the problem, it was new characters, and this has been a problem for Marvel for a very, very long time. People like the classics. Marvel has had a problem for decades creating new characters that resonated with people the way the old ones did. Captain America, Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, the Fantastic Four, those were the characters people wanted to read. But what people didn't want to see was diversity for the sake of diversity, and that's what Marvel started pushing. They started making characters all about race and gender and sexuality. It wasn't a character who just happened to be black. It was a character that exuded blackness as their major characteristic. It wasn't having a gay superhero, a hero who just so happened to be gay. It was a gay character that just so happened to be a superhero. It was when Marvel stopped telling stories about superheroes and started telling stories about identity politics that just so happened to have superheroes in them that fans gave up in droves. And that's why Marvel's sales tanked and why they went from being the undisputed king of comic sales to the number 3 position. Their failure was paying any attention to the regressive left.
But last year, that same vice president noted that women make up 40% of Marvel's readers.
Which doesn't actually mean anything. Just because you're a woman doesn't make you an SJW. It doesn't make you a liberal. It doesn't mean that you give a damn about diversity in comics or anything else. So what was the point of bringing that up again?
And some of Marvel's diverse characters are actually resonating. Miss Marvel features Pakistani-American Muslim teen Kamala Khan as its superhero, and the character's co-creator, Sana Amanat, has said that the comic is a #1 digital bestseller for Marvel.
No, not really. Now, let's take a look at the titles that they had on screen. They had A-Force, which has had 2 different series, one that appeared before Marvel's Civil War II and ran for 5 issues, and one that appeared after and ran for 10. And the sales figures tell the story. Issue number 1 of the second series sold 114,528 issues, while issue 9 in September 2016 sold 23,484. And that's a 79% decrease in sales. And they were desperate to keep the title going. They went through 3 writers and 4 artists in 15 issues. So what about Spider-Woman? Sales have completely tanked, with issue number 12 selling only 16,176, the second worst of the Spider-Verse titles. And if you look at the other female-fronted Marvel comics, they are being canceled left and right. Black Widow and Scarlet Witch both died horrible deaths. But what about Ms. Marvel? Far from being a top-selling book, her comic has dropped from 30,916 issues a year ago to just 19,890 now. This is not what success looks like.
Just last year, the Black Panther series sold more than 250,000 copies in North America alone.
That's total sales for the entire year. When you figure it out per issue, that's only 21,104 comics per issue sold to retailers, and that's dismal. The first issue was the number 1 comic of April 2016, but it immediately dropped in sales. The spin-off series, Black Panther and the Crew, a comic featuring all black heroes, died a quick death, canceled after only the second issue. And that's probably a record of some sort.
And a movie is in the works with a cast that Marvel's president has said is 90% African or African American.
Indeed there is, and I hope it's good because I am a fan of Black Panther. But if it follows the modern Marvel take on things, I expect it to have a huge opening weekend and then quickly die as people see that it's all hype and no substance, all identity and no quality. But I guess we'll have to wait and see.
So what's the one thing those successes have in common? They were created by people who reflect the characters they're writing.
If these are successes, I'd hate to see what you think are failures. And no, none of these characters are written by people who reflect the character, unless the writers can fly and shoot laser beams out of their eyes. But then again, you idiots don't actually want comics, you want identity politics in serial form.
They want to have their cake and eat it too. They can represent black women on the page, they can represent disabled people on the page if they'd like, but they don't really hire black women. They don't hire disabled people.
Hold on a minute. Maybe I'm confused here, but don't you hire writers on the basis that they can write? Don't you hire artists on the basis that they can draw? It sure sounds to me like you want quotas in comic books that are based not on the skill of the person hired, but on their physical characteristics. Are you really that stupid?
Men outnumber women 9-1 in the comics industry.
So what? What difference does it make? People are hired based on skill, on merit, not what's between their legs.
And 79% of those men are white.
Which is totally irrelevant. It has nothing to do with their ability to write, or to draw, or to edit comic books. The color of one's skin doesn't have a thing to do with their merit as creators.
Which is pretty strange for an industry whose heroes are meant to represent the underdog.
No, they're actually not. In fact, superheroes are supposed to be something for the underdog to aspire to be. That's how Stan Lee created most of these characters. There were people that your average Joe could see some of themselves in, that people could identify with, and then who did amazing and heroic things. These are people you wanted to become, not people you already were.
World War II marked what's called the Golden Age for comics, when mostly Jewish creators drew characters who fought for the common people and took down Nazis.
It's the Golden Age. It's not an ideal. It's a label. It was where comics started, but comics have gone through multiple ages since. This is just yet another attempt to influence a largely ignorant audience by people who either don't know better or simply don't care about the facts. But what else is new?
And it's not to say that, white men can't write anything but white men, but instead that that level of authenticity that has been kind of disregarded for a long time is clearly responding with the readers in a big way, and it seems that Marvel's rejecting that.
No, the readers are rejecting that. Marvel's just being a business and doing what all businesses have to do. Make money. Marvel tried it your way, and your grand social justice experiment has failed.
But if Marvel can make fans feel emotionally invested in a gun-toting raccoon, then surely they're up to the challenge of including more women and people of color.
The reason Rocket resonated with people is because Rocket acted like a person. He was something that the viewer could identify with, even if he wasn't human. It was great characterization first, species second. But what you idiots want to do is make it race first, gender first, sexuality first, and characterization a distant second, if at all. Oh, lots of people are sharing it. Just not for the reason you want them to. People see right through your identity politics nonsense. And that's the thing. There are serious problems at Marvel right now. A big part of it is playing the SJW card, but that's not the only problem. Now, personally, I think that a huge issue is that Disney owns Marvel, and they figure they don't actually have to perform. They can just live off both Disney's money and Marvel's movies. I think a lot of people see the comics as a loss leader, a place for the movies to milk for ideas, but not one that has to succeed on its own. Now, I could go on and talk about this for hours, and to be honest, I have over at my geek-related blog, where I used to review comics and talk about comics a lot, but all that's really gone away. The comic industry has essentially fallen apart, largely because reading 20-page floppies that cost $4 a piece and are stuffed full of ads and are purposely kept slow-paced so you have to keep coming back and buying more, those are largely obsolete in the modern world. There are better ways to spend your money, and there's a lot more out there to spend your money on. And that's why comic companies went to gimmicks in the mid-90s, desperate to get people to buy their books, pretending that investing in comics would put your kids through college, etc. And that's why Marvel went bankrupt. But sales of comics have been dropping big time for decades. I mean, go back to the 60s, where Batman averaged nearly 900,000 issues a month. That's every single month. But by 1969, it had dropped to 355,000, and by 2009, Batman was down to 76,000. Look at Spider-Man, which in 1969 was selling 372,000, and today does just over 61,000 if they're lucky. So the comic market has been disintegrating slowly for a long time. It isn't only Marvel's recent focus on diversity that has cost them sales. In fact, it's been their desperation to make sales that has led them to pay any attention to the SJWs. And where they made their mistake is that the SJWs aren't reading comics. They don't care. SJWs are like locusts. They swarm to a fandom or a special interest group and they consume everything, leaving nothing behind, and then they move on to destroy something else. The same thing happened to video games with Anita Sarkeesian and Gamergate. It happened to atheism with Atheism Plus. Who knows where they're going to crop up next? These people don't care about Marvel. They don't care about comics. They have an agenda, and it has nothing at all to do with comic books. It has to do with identity politics. They couldn't care less if Marvel succeeds or fails because they're not reading Marvel comics to begin with. The fact is, SJWs are just leading Marvel to shit on their own properties. We don't need a female Thor. We don't need a Hispanic Spider-Man. We don't need a female Iron Man. We need well-written characters with interesting personalities in compelling stories. The SJWs don't care about any of that. They want race, gender, and sexuality first, and who cares about the rest? Oh, maybe the people who are buying the comics? Yeah, but who cares about them anyway, right?
Everything changes.